Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's briefing. Before we continue, a reminder that simultaneous interpretation is available. You can access it by clicking the globe icon and selecting your preferred language, English or Spanish, in the bottom of your screen. Un recordatorio que la conversación de hoy se llevará a cabo en inglés. Pueden usar el icono de
Today's
interpretación
conversation is in
que
English. You can use the
presente en la
interpretation icon,
parte
which you can
derecha
find
de su
in
pantalla.
the bottom part of your
My name is
screen.
Dulce Guzmán, and I am the Executive Director of Alianza Americas, a transnational network of migrant-led organizations from Latin America and the Caribbean based in the United States. Alianza Americas, in collaboration with our member organization, the Latino Policy Forum, and our partner, the Resurrection Project, organized a delegation of community leaders from Chicago, tracing one of the many deportation routes that began in El Paso, Texas, took us to Ciudad Juárez, Mexico, and finally in Mexico City, Mexico. Understanding the dynamics, policies, and realities in Mexico is important for many reasons. Mexicans are the largest immigrant population in the United States, and the Chicago metropolitan area is home to one of the largest portions of this population. Deportations to Mexico have always been high. This is not something new. In part, it's due to our large number of population, but as places like Chicago and LA very well know, it's also because of the discriminatory practices of racial profiling that are used in our community. Mexico has also historically been a key player in terms of migration in and from the region, and has quickly left behind their identity of being known as a transit country, meaning migrants traveling through Mexico to get to the US, to now being known as a destination country. It's important for us to understand and to learn more about where people from Mexico are being disappeared to. This includes deportations and also people who have been forced to return due to fear for their safety or other pressure created by social, political, and economic conditions in the US. The purpose of this delegation was to deepen our understanding of regional migration dynamics and to strengthen transnational commitments to social justice and the human rights of migrants. Our delegation brought together a cross-section of leaders, each playing an influential role in fighting back against the administration's mass deportation campaign and fear tactics. The delegation included Illinois State Senator Celina Villanueva, Isabela Hurtado of the Governor's Office for New Americans, a journalist from the Chicago Tribune, Pastor Kenneth Phelps, and staff of Chicago organizations who are on the front lines informing and defending the rights of our communities, two of which are joining us here today. Throughout the visit, participants engaged directly with actors in Mexico, listened to testimonies from migrants, and observed local humanitarian response efforts, support services, and inclusion strategies. This experience offered a critical opportunity to advance humane, informed public policies rooted in transnational community solidarity. Our ongoing goal is to improve coordinated efforts that help prepare, inform, and support families impacted by deportation and forced return. Today's briefing is going to present an overview of the findings from our recent fact-finding trip, and we are also pleased to share with you the full delegation report that is now available on our public drive for those of you who wish to explore the findings, observations, and get a little more in-depth into our recommendations. We encourage you to review it for a more detailed understanding of the realities we encountered. During this session, we are also going to highlight key observations, share participants' experiences and perspectives, and offer a synopsis of the recommendations we are making to policymakers and service providers. To help us reflect on these findings and consider possible policy alternatives, we are joined by 3 delegates from the trip who bring experience and strategic vision. With us, we have Pastor Dr. Kenneth Phelps, Senior Pastor of Concord Baptist Church and Executive Director of Concord Community Organization. We also have Tovia Siegel, Organizing Director of the Resurrection Project, and Linda Tortolero, President of the Latino Policy Forum. We're going to start now with this first part, looking at the main findings, exploring the challenges and the opportunities. And first, we will start with Tovia, who will tell us a little bit about what she observed during that first visit in El Paso, our first stop of the delegation tour. Tovia, what did you observe when we visited the Mexican consulate in El Paso? How does this differ from what you know that's happening here in Chicago with the consulate?
Yeah, so hi everyone. Great to have a chance to talk to you. Once again, my name is Tovia Siegel. I'm the organizing director at the Resurrection Project. And I was really curious to visit the Mexican consulate in El Paso because we work closely with the Mexican consulate in Chicago. At the Resurrection Project, we are there on an almost weekly basis to provide resources and talk to Mexican nationals who are coming to the consulate for all kinds of services and refer them to other resources available in Chicago. We also work with the local consulate to contact Mexican nationals who are in detention, in deportation proceedings. And it was fascinating to meet with the Mexican consulate in El Paso. They are, they're a government entity, so they were certainly sort of giving the party line a bit in terms of how things function. The officials we talked to basically said that there were no issues, that they worked very well with the US federal government. They really didn't see many human rights abuses. And if they did ever get reports of human rights abuses, there were effective protocols to follow and that those were always followed. So that is, runs counter to what we hear from our base, right, and our members about what is actually happening. But it was really helpful to have that perspective of like, this is the line, this is the narrative that the Mexican government is putting forward for, I imagine, all kinds of political interests, right? Different interests, so that when we went to Mexico and talked to NGOs there and talked to people there, we could compare that experience with what we were hearing from the government, which was basically like, everything's working, everything is great, whether you're in detention here in the US or are a Mexican national who arrives after deportation or who chooses, quote unquote, chooses to return. And so that was, I think it informed the rest of the trip in terms of like, this is the official narrative, and then we can hear the reality.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was really interesting, and from what you're sharing, that the treatment or the service that people receive when they go to the Mexican consulate can differ depending in what city or state they may be in. Because I think also something that we heard and we know is that we have a great working relationship with the Chicago Mexican consulate. But I think something else that we observed is that the consulates are in very great need of additional resources to meet the demand that we are seeing in Chicago, but really across the country. So thank you for sharing a little bit about our first stop, which was in El Paso. Now I want to turn over to Linda, who's going to tell us a little bit about what we observed once we arrived to Ciudad Juarez. We got to visit one of Mexico's 11 reception centers. So, Linda, how are these facilities operating? What support does the Mexican government provide to deportees once they arrive into one of these reception centers?
Again, thank you, Dulce, for that question. I think the thing that I was most struck by was the enormity of the reception center. From the outside, there is security. You go through a gate. There are folks waiting for you if you are both a guest or somebody who is looking for resources, as somebody who's either been forcibly returned or deported back into Mexico. You get processed in a reception area within the reception center, by which they're trying to find more in details about you as a Mexican citizen, where you're from, how many people are traveling with you. And so I think that was kind of interesting, the way they kind of navigated that space. And the vastness of the center really led to the fact that they are trying to, one, provide shelter, to provide bathrooms where people can take showers. Many individuals are arriving without having had a meal or having clothes on their, fresh clothes on their backs, or not being able to have had a shower, or just even getting rest. And so, they talked a lot about how they kind of introduced people into the space. And even and there was space that children were occupying, because some children, they are had not received schooling for whatever time it took for them to be processed in the United States and then brought back to Mexico. So I think from like almost, having worked in social services as long as I've had, I think the Mexican government was trying to make the reception center as friendly as possible, given the limitations of the enormity of the space. But I can only imagine how difficult it is to be in a place that really felt like a big warehouse. And I can't imagine like kind of the trauma of any individual, especially a child or a woman, who is most likely going to be segregated from any of the men in the space, but also being asked a lot of questions, personal questions about how they were approached by the U.S. government, or how they were treated by the U.S. government, what kind of any violence that they may have suffered before they are processed and given resources to go back to their city or their pueblo of origin. And so for me, I think that when I think about reception, it is a reception, but how warm it is, I don't know if that's a place that I would actually use as a way to demonstrate Mexico's commitment of the Mexico Te Abraza program. I think as someone who is a Mexican American, and I first learned about the creation of the Mexico Te Abraza program under the previous President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, as an outsider looking in, it was very much like, oh, this is a great step of Mexico. And in the sense that they're creating this department, yes, that is all very well and good. But I also want to think about that this use of space and how we treat people when we're in that space, those are two different things. And I think that for me, it was very overwhelming to see people being processed in that kind of environment. I think the other thing that I really want to also talk about is that they were trying to be comprehensive in the use of like informational booths. So one can only imagine the kind of access to information that a Mexican citizen being forcibly returned or deported will need to go back to their either city or pueblo of origin. Do they need health services? How do they make sure that their child, if they're traveling with children, can go back into school? Do they have any documentation to show that they're a Mexican citizen? Do they need any copies of that? So in that sense, I think that's really important because the Mexican government is very vast. And without kind of the proper identification, that individual may not have the right kind of paperwork so that they can even be successfully integrated into Mexican society. So that in that itself is very important. I think the thing that, and this may go a little bit more into what I was sharing earlier, my concern about how warm and how friendly and how engaging the space is that there is an absence of kind of the social service sector that is allowed to be in these in these reception centers. I think that it would be of great benefit to have kind of nonprofits, community justice or social justice organizations or churches to have access to these spaces so that they can be that bridge for those Mexicans who are going to be traveling back to where they're from. And I say this because we have to recognize that these are individuals with a wide area of challenges for them to be integrated. Some may have left as children, some may have left as adults. Some people, they can't actually travel back to their place of origin within Mexico because of the dangers of cartels or the destruction of their villages due to environmental concerns. There are a whole gamut of reasons why some folks don't want to go back. And also this whole idea of, when you say te abraza, there's a connotation there that we're trying to hug you. And that has to be really demonstrated by not just the government, but also allowing access for civil society, again, those not-for-profits, to be part of that. And so I think that that is where there's more opportunity for growth of the Mexican government as they think about what this next chapter of Mexico Te Abraza will be. Because given the current Trump administration, we can only assume that there will be more deported and forcibly returned Mexican citizens who will be looking for guidance from the Mexican government and will be asking for accountability with regards to their own rights as they return back to their own home states and home towns.
Thank you, Linda. I think that I mean, all of what you said was really important, but something that we learned in this experience is that Mexico Te Abraza promises, I think about 2,000 pesos, if I'm not mistaken, which is like the equivalent of like $100 for people that are deported. It's not accessible to people who return on their own because, as you mentioned, like Mexico has a huge bureaucracy, I don't know if you call it problem or challenge, that there's many things and hoops that you have to jump through to get a specific service or to get an answer to your question. So people that are returning on their own, and we're seeing it's many people who are, reaching out to the consulate or reaching out to organizations saying, hey, how can I get help to return back? That help is not actually available to them. And I think the other thing that we learned is that in Mexico, in order for somebody who's a national to even get around and train, you have to have a valid identification. And through the consulates, we learned that a lot of people, I mean, not everyone gets their things, personal items taken once they arrive in detention. And many times those belongings do not get returned. So they're arriving to a country that they're unfamiliar with without having even an identification to move around in the country. And I think these are some of the other issues and aspects that we learned about that are making it increasingly just very difficult for people that are arriving to the country to settle and adapt to a new reality. So thank you for pointing those things out. I want to move us now to talk about the role of civil society in this, because I think we've heard a little bit about the role of the government, what the government is and isn't doing. But as Pastor Phelps will tell us in a second, there's also a big role that civil society is playing in terms of responding and supporting arrivals in Mexico City. Pastor Phelps, what did you learn about how organizations in Mexico are responding? What has been the role of shelters in Mexico in accompanying migrants?
Well, first of all, Dulce, thank you so much. And I want to express my gratitude to all of the organizations and partners who, put this together. Again, the journey was truly, eye-opening and life-changing for me. So I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to learn and to witness and to grow because of this collective effort. So thank you all. Again, we had an opportunity to visit many organizations, and most of the organizations that, again, we visited in Mexico have been actually used to working with non-Mexican immigrants. So there's never been really designated funding, from my understanding, designated funding to support Mexican immigrants who are returning to their country of origin. They really honestly have left many gaps, and only a handful of organizations in the entire country are doing this, an accompaniment and integrated work. We met some incredible organizations, two of which I'll cite. First is CAFAMEN, I think I'm pronouncing it right, with Sister Magda. I was really, really deeply impressed by the work of Sister Magda and the CAFAMEN shelter, particularly their comprehensive approach to legal services and wraparound support, and specifically the vocational training aspect. And what stood out in their approach was mostly how intentionally they were trying to prepare their residents for life beyond their stay. And during our visit, I think that the residents graciously prepared breakfast for us, pastries by the shelter's residents, and coffee actually prepared by baristas in training. And so this was not only just hospitable, but it was really powerful. It was demonstrated how dignity and skill building are woven into the daily life of those at CAFAMEN. And when residents transition from the shelter, they at least do have marketable skills and on-the-job training experience that I think better position them to secure employment in Mexico or their final destination if they choose to go, somewhere else. So it was truly impressive and inspiring model to accompaniment and empowerment. The other one I would like to cite, the other organization I'd like to cite is Sin Fronteras. And again, their legal and educational support. I was really impressed by their facility. And really actually had an opportunity to connect with Daniel, who serves, I think, as the Spanish as a second language instructor and director of their virtual Spanish program. And so after learning about the program, I actually literally, when I got back, I reached back out to everybody that we had met, and I actually applied and was accepted into that program. And so I'm actively enrolled in virtual Spanish classes through Fronteras, which has both a practical as well as meaningful extension of this experience. And so this connection has really strengthened my approach for a holistic approach addressing legal needs while at the same time equipping individuals as well as leadership with the tools for communications, integrations, and advocacy. So that's how I respond to that question.
Thank you, Pastor Phelps. I also, and correct me, I might be remembering this incorrectly, but we've heard from some organizations that there's even people who are non-Mexicans who are thinking about going to Mexico. So I think you have received a call from one of the Venezuelan asylum seekers looking for information. So I don't know if you want to share a little bit more about that and the connection you made.
Absolutely. Well, some people are self-deporting, as you know, but they definitely do not want to go back to Venezuela, and they've actually contacted me to see whether or not we can arrange and make, connections with Mexico as as a location to actually migrate to. So we've been actually trying to put them in touch with some of the organizations, and I believe they're en route there now. So yeah, this has just been, great. And again, like I said, it does seem like, Mexico has been open to receiving not only just Mexican citizens, but also non-Mexican citizens, as places to, to land in their migration effort.
Yeah, I think a note I want to make about that is that something that we learned was that, as you said, Mexico is receiving non-Mexican nationals. And something else that we learned is that Mexico has been limiting the opportunities to find humanitarian visas. So I think civil society, as you mentioned, has been very welcoming and receptive in finding ways to provide these wraparound services, as you mentioned. But in some cases, these non-Mexican nationals are basically being sent to the southern point of the country and
Yes.
basically released, expecting them to just find their path to another country. And here I want to make another connection of what we learned, which was that with USAID funding being cut, we learned that several organizations who were doing this work of supporting non-Mexican migrants lost their funding opportunities. So there's no funding really for supporting non-Mexicans, and there's really no structured way of supporting Mexicans. It's very, I think, a very challenging and dire reality that we're learning about. But I want to, I guess, turn us to that to understand a little bit more about the conditions people are returning to. And for that, I want to start with Linda. If you could share a little bit more about the conditions that people are returning to Mexico as it relates to safety, economic stability, and integration. And what do you think that decision makers in Illinois need to know specifically about this?
So I think that one of the, we have to be reminded by the fact that many immigrants to our country, immigrants throughout the world, oftentimes are leaving because of lack of economic opportunity, challenges in given the social political environment that they are, a decline of democratic practices or values, corruption, and whatnot. There is no reason to believe that any Mexican citizen who has left Mexico to immigrate to the United States is going back to a situation that has improved in any significant way. And so I think for those individuals who have not had formal education or any kind of job training, going back to Mexico is very challenging. And then also compounding that with the fact that many Mexican citizens are from rural parts of Mexico, primarily from areas either northern or the western coast or parts of central Mexico that have been bombarded with violence from cartels and the drug trafficking that has ensued. One thing that we also have to take into account is that the cartels are not only introducing drugs to the area and the fabrication of drugs, but also drug use has proliferated throughout Mexico. There are challenges with regards to land rights and access to agricultural products that are being done in rural Mexico. And so oftentimes individuals who are being deported or forcibly returned or self-deporting, which are not actually being able to go back to where their home area is. And that's really frightening. So what is their social structure? What is their familial structure that they're returning to help alleviate some of the stress that they are feeling coming back? There have been some instances where the Mexican government has been able to kind of partner with job opportunities. I know that some Mexican citizens are coming back speaking English very well, maybe not speaking Spanish as well, because their education, most of their formal education has been in the United States, where Spanish language, both in composition and comprehension is very limited. And, where can they use their English speaking skills? And then at the same time, how do you fill that gap where their lack of formal Spanish education will put them at a deficit in terms of their ability to seek any kind of job opportunity or workforce development training that they would need for them to be as successful as possible living in Mexico. So I think those are the kind of challenges that they are facing. I think the other thing that, really struck me too is, when we had the opportunity to meet some of the young organizers who had been raised in the United States and wanted to make sure that they were contributing to kind of the understanding that they would demand social justice. They demand that the Mexican government is accountable to their own experiences now as returned Mexican citizens, and that there are certain expectations with regards to how the Mexican government should be providing resources and services to them. And what they have seen as kind of a vibrant civil society that they have experienced as U.S. residents, whether documented, undocumented or not. And so I think that, there is this opportunity for those Mexican citizens, especially the youth, to kind of educate civil society as to what does vibrant civic engagement practices look like? How do you call to action and work with others, nonprofits and civil agencies to really demand, the rights and access to kind of resources that, other countries provide their young people, other countries provide their citizens and their families. And so to me, kind of having that vibrant energy was really inspiring because it was really reminiscent of kind of the organizing you see here in Chicago and other parts of the country where young people and others are kind of like leading in that kind of awakening of civil society and what should happen in that movement. But I think the other thing too is that, it continues to be economic instability. We are only seeing from here in the United States, Mexico's experiences with the Trump administration and pressures being placed on Mexico to also copy many of the tariff practices that the United States is doing, and what that will actually mean for livability and affordability for Mexican families. As tariffs are now being introduced by the Mexican government, and that will definitely have a large impact on the ability of people to live with dignity and be able to afford a life that they can provide themselves and their children. And I think that for a lot of those individuals, it's not just reintegrating into society that many of them do not know, but also trying to figure out what is that pathway to like education or job that will allow them to have a semblance of a life that they had aspired to when they lived in the United States. And so I think that those kind of conditions kind of almost bring kind of like an American sense of like democratic practice that can be introduced into Mexican society, where there's that expectation that you are accountable to your citizens, you are accountable to families, and that we expect the government to work with civil service organizations to make sure that those rights and those services and those provisions that we all expect are enjoyed by all. And so I think that for me, that there's an opportunity there that although the Mexican government may not love, you do want to see that practice of we demand our rights, you are accountable to us, and we expect answers, and we expect a dialogue and a true partnership with civil society and government.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, there was many organizations that we talked to, and you all can learn more about these organizations in the report that really promoted not just the civic engagement in Mexico, but also thought about like what can we do transnationally. People in the U.S. can also do things to help improve conditions there. So thank you for sharing and elevating that. I want to turn to now Pastor Phelps to tell us a little bit more about the challenges that people face when they're forced to return to a country they may no longer know or recognize. And Linda already started talking a little bit about how language barriers and job opportunity might be part of those challenges. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, there you go. I'm sorry. So it was interesting, and I forget the name of the last organization that we went to, I think the final days there. But anyway, they were the one that raised the issue of racism and xenophobia that are real and growing. Many of the returnees are treated as outsiders because of how they speak, how they dress, and even some of the indigenous people that are actually returning to Mexico City. They're labeled as not really from here, which kind of creates a stigma and isolation instead of welcome. The other thing that we've learned is that time always matters. Like sometimes, um, individuals have gone for 20 or 30 years or even more before returning. And during that time, their families and their network has disappeared. Communities have changed. Support system has eroded. And many are returning at near retirement age and with, no limited job prospects or limited access to social safety networks or even governmental assistance. I even think back to when we were in Juarez, Mexico, and we were learning about, the process and, some of them are getting, tickets back to their place of origin, in which it's changed. It's no longer what they're not returning to what they're used to. So, and lastly, for those who um, who arrived in the U.S. as children, the trauma is even deeper. They may have no memory of the country that they're being sent to. Their language skills may be limited. I think as aforementioned, their cultural references are different. And suddenly, they're expected to rebuild a life in a place that feels foreign, despite being their quote quote country of origin. And so they're discovering that there are also bureaucratic barriers, and some of them are overwhelming, and trying to navigate, again, like you mentioned, the documentation, housing, healthcare, and even employment systems, especially in countries where federal agencies are difficult to access or slow to respond, can really create frustration and despair. And so without advocates and guidance, many, fall through the cracks. And again, there really is an invisible cost, and that is a cost of trauma, of grief, of shame, dislocation, and loss of identity. So deportation, doesn't just move the body across the border. It fractures families, it erases stability, and it leaves, people searching for dignity and for belonging. And so that's why the wraparound services and support and accompaniment across the borders, and what we're kind of talking about, cross-border collaborations, including even faith communities and NGOs and government partners, are not optional. They are essential, for helping survival and restoration.
Thank you. I remember us talking, I mean, there's been a lot of conversation around, people being disappeared because people are being taken, and we don't know what happens to them, where they are in the country, but we know that some of them are winding up in Mexico. And when they get to Mexico, there's kind of like this, like nobody talks about what happens afterwards. And that really stuck with me through comments that Tovia was making throughout the delegation. So I wanted to also invite Tovia to maybe speak a little bit more about what you experienced and learned when you were talking to people who had returned, not this year, not last year, but who faced these same things about 8 to 10 years ago. So I don't know if you want to share a little bit more about those conversations you had.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dulce, and thanks, Pastor Phelps and Linda, for your comments too, because they're reminding me of new things that, we talked about or I've thought about since. I think, first of all, just understanding the process of, okay, so backing up, I think in the US, the organizations that work with immigrants and work to try to prevent deportations understand the process up until the moment someone is deported really well. We understand what people's experience living as an immigrant in the United States is, in the event of detention, what happens, in the event of deportation proceedings, what happens, and even up to the moment of deportation. Like there have been so many times where I've been on the phone with, a family and saying that the person's now going to be put on a deportation flight. But after that, what happens, at least the organizations that we work closely with, we don't really know or haven't really invested in knowing deeply and communicating to people. And unfortunately, because we are seeing such an increase in deportations, especially of people who have been here for a long time, I think it's incumbent upon us as organizations who provide trusted information to people so that they can make decisions about their own lives, that we try to communicate as much of this information as possible and gather it first and then communicate it or connect them to the people who have this information or the resources. And so that was really key, is just learning like what happens after, once somebody arrives in Mexico, or if somebody chooses to leave, and I say choose in air quotes, because it's sort of a non-choice. If you don't feel safe living here or in Mexico, that's not a real choice, but it is a decision many people are being forced to make right now. And so if that is a decision that you make, what happens then? So one, just having access to that information is really key, so we can include it in the resources that we are sharing, include it, share it with families of people who are being deported or who have been deported. And I think, another piece of it that was really significant to me was learning how people in organizations in Mexico are communicating this information to Mexican nationals who have been deported or are returning. And some of the strategies are really similar to ones we use here. Like one really concrete similar strategy was that one of the organizations we talked to has a palm card, like a business card sized card of what your rights are if you are a deported Mexican national. And I'm sure folks on this call know that we use Know Your Rights palm cards as like our, holy grail. They're distributed by the tens of thousands in Chicago and all over the country, and to see that that's a really useful tool, right? And that it can be repurposed. And that was taken actually from, those are organizers who had been in the United States and had been deported and had converted that that tool into a version that serves folks who have been deported. So understanding sort of both those similarities and opportunities for us to share more information, connect with more resources for folks here who may, who are at risk of deportation, or folks who have family members who have been deported, was really significant.
Thank you, Tovia. And our staff just put in the chat a link to a pamphlet that we have on our website that goes over knowing your rights here and there. And then also we'll share where you can find that green card that says Know Your Rights that Tovia was talking about, that Otros Dreams en Acción has been sharing. And before we go into closing reflections, I just want to thank the audience again for being here, for recognizing the importance of us learning about what's happening in other countries and how we can help people better prepare for these situations. Please send over your questions. We want to hear from you. We want to know your comments, other thoughts that you're having. but now I want to provide a space for reflection for each of the participants to share with us just any last things you want to share, insights or personal reflections that you want to share about what you witnessed on this delegation to Mexico as it relates to the realities of deportation, forced return, the humanitarian response, or just ways that organizations here in Chicago can be better prepared, better equipped to support families that are facing this reality right now. And we can start maybe with Linda.
Sure. First, I want to thank Alianza Americas and to my colleagues for providing this opportunity. You know, my experience with deportation is really just family members who have been deported or have returned based on legal advice that the best pathway for them to become legal residents is to go back to Mexico and hope they can come back to the United States. And they're going back to the rural parts of Mexico that my family is from. And so to see kind of another viewpoint, other stories of what it means to return to Mexico was very powerful as a Mexican American. And I think really made me kind of angry in the sense that I feel like we should be doing more, both as individuals here in Chicago and in the United States, to help ease the pain, to ease the trauma of those that are being forcibly returned and deported. You know, what I believe that there is a lot of responsibility that we can hold, and there are opportunities to make their lives easier so that they can integrate back into Mexico. And at the same time, I get angry at the fact that I feel that there are a lot of resources in Mexico. And that I don't take lightly this idea that, you know, without having US aid or with other, without, you know, international resources, Mexico can't do more and do what's right by their brothers and sisters that are being forcibly returned or deported, in terms of providing them pathways to dignified lives, of finding jobs that suit their interest, of galvanizing resources around them, and also helping them find a pathway to bring back all that they have and all their talents to Mexico so that Mexico is more prosperous and benefits from that. And so I think that we should all expect more in the way that Mexico is treating our brothers and sisters who, for whatever reasons and much beyond their abilities, are having to go back and finding, you know, kind of fears that they are facing and the lack of opportunities that they are uncovering as they are there.
Thank you, Linda. Tovia, would you like to go?
Sure. There's so much I could say in reflection, but just trying to sort of boil it down, I think there are two points I'd like to make. So the first is that it was inspiring for me as an organizer to be reminded that people are organizing everywhere and under all kinds of conditions. We spoke to folks who are political exiles from Central American countries seeking refuge in Mexico, and you know, it was reminiscent of a lot of the crackdowns on organizers and people speaking out here in the United States now. And you know, we also spoke to people whose organizations whose funding had been cut in half or, you know, massively reduced, also reminiscent of many things happening right now in the United States. And so just the reminder that there are people organizing under all conditions, resisting under all conditions, wherever they are, gave me renewed strength and hope, and knowing that, you know, wherever we are, there will be people resisting and under all conditions. So I think that was really powerful. And then another thing I took away was thinking a lot about the language we use and narrative we use to talk about deportation and return, which we think a ton about narrative in terms of migration to the United States and the right to stay and thrive. But we often talk about migration as like a one-directional movement from another country to the United States. And I felt like I was really challenged to think about the ways that political systems and social systems and economic systems force people to move in many directions and oftentimes multiple times throughout their life. And that much of the movement is forced, and it's important that we acknowledge that. And when we talk about things like self-deportation, that sounds like somebody is making a choice to be forced to leave, right? Which isn't really one, like I mentioned earlier, not really a choice. And so I was challenged to think about the language that we use and the way that we narrativize both migration and deportation using a broader perspective than the one that I think we often do as immigrant rights organizers in the US. So I'll be thinking about that and bringing that back to my work.
Thank you, Tovia. Pastor Phelps?
Again, thank you so much for this opportunity to share reflections, and thank you so much for the experience again. It really, really, it profoundly shaped me as a faith leader. It moved me from the mindset of just helping, to one of accompaniment, literally like walking alongside the migrants with humility, respect, and shared humanity. I think being on the ground made it clear that migration is not just a crisis of people, but it is also a crisis of systems, history, and broken policies. And also there's a faith component, right? And seeing the conditions firsthand actually deepen my understanding that migration is not just a crisis of people, but again, as I said, a crisis of systems. And faith calls us, right, to not just provide charity, but to walk alongside people with dignity, humanity, as well as humility. It also, strengthened my commitment to racial solidarity. Black and brown communities, share deep, interconnected stories, right, of displacement, resilience, and this journey to Mexico, really reaffirmed that solidarity is sacred work, right? And so faith cannot just be practiced at a distance, and proximity builds empathy, and empathy calls us all to action. And so I was inspired by what I experienced, and I would just often share with those that that we came in contact with, that they're not alone, and that not only were Mexican Americans or white Americans concerned, but also Black Americans is also concerned about what's happening in that region. And so I returned home uh, not just inspired, but accountable, and also to educate, accountable to educate my congregation, and to create, right, space for migrant voices, and to translate faith into justice. And I am determined to continue supporting migrants. It's not just political for me. It's pastoral, it's biblical, and it's essential to who I am and who I think we're called to be.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing those closing reflections. We're going to take a couple questions before we close with some recommendations. And I'm going to couple them a little bit because I think some of them could be answered together. One of them is, what, if anything, do you think organizations in Mexico that you met with learned from you or the delegation? And then the other one was, what may be some opportunities to build alliances with organizations in Mexico that are working with deportees? Whoever wants to take a stab.
So I had the opportunity to go and to talk to students and professors at one of the legal aid clinics that is associated with one of the most prosperous and predominant universities in Mexico City. And I think one of the things that was surprising for them was the fact that we're well aware of some of the work that they're doing, and that there be opportunities to to take advantage of the fact that there are individuals in the United States that are very interested in questions about migration, about broken systems, about family members or friends or neighbors that are being forcibly returned or reported. That we are very curious to see kind of who are those people, or what are those organizations or those clinics that are resisting kind of the narrative that Mexico cannot be or doesn't want to really fully embrace migrants, and support those that, for whatever reasons, as Tovia talked about, there are a lot of political asylees that are looking for refuge in Mexico. And that common refrain that Mexico is no longer a place of passage, but now a place of destiny for many refugees. And so I think one of the things I hope that they took away in all of our visits is that there is a real yearning for understanding of what's going on in Mexico, what our responsibility is as Americans towards the political situation that manifests, that puts Mexico in particular in difficult situations with regards to migration, and that I, as a person who spent so much of my career fundraising, that there are probably opportunities to raise funds with those U.S. residents and citizens who really want to provide support to those that have been forcibly returned, or political asylees in Mexico who, for whatever reasons, are able to find a home here in the United States.
Thank you, Linda.
And I'll add, just in terms of something really concrete, we were there in Mexico right as the Operation Midway Blitz, the mass deportation campaign in the Chicago area, was beginning. And we were able to tell organizations there that it was likely that there were going to be a lot of people from the Chicago area who would be deported in the coming months, and that meant that there would be families separated, right, with some people in Mexico and some people here in the United States, and that there would be a lot of need for legal support, social support, and that they could reach out to us if if they needed help getting documents from here, contacting family members, things like that. And so just really concretely having those contacts and connections, especially right now, today, right, especially quite literally today when CBP has returned to Chicago in mass. I think that will be really valuable.
And also they many of them, one of the projects that I learned of is the Casa Nostro Padre project, that's offered by CAFAMIN, the opportunities for collaboration, and they're looking for support. But many of them, again, I think have opportunities for collaboration. So you can definitely reach out to those organizations that, that are supporting, and which I'm sure Dulce and the team has a whole list of them that we can just kind of connect with. But they are always looking for partners and looking for, people to support the work. So I think there's great opportunity for collaboration.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing those. And I think something I would add that Linda and I think all of you covered a little bit is just how important it is for organizations from the US to go and visit, to learn and understand the realities that people are experiencing, the hardships that people are arriving to, and to demonstrate to the US and Mexican government that we are watching, that we are monitoring what is happening to our brothers and sisters, to our community, and that we have recommendations for ways that we can improve it. So we're not idly standing by. We have thought about things that we can do to improve conditions for what's happening, and to hold accountable the administration for the violation of rights that are taking place. So thank you. And we encourage funders, we encourage organizations, if it's possible, to make the trip, whether it is to Mexico or another country that's receiving deportees. It's important for us to track and document what is happening. So now we're going to close out with just a short overview of some of the recommendations. It's not an exhaustive list of everything. We again invite you to look at the report, to learn more in depth who we met with, where we visited, and what recommendations we have for the Mexican government, for the U.S. federal government, and for community organizations. A few for the Mexican government. First is to develop integration, and inclusion policies that have dedicated funding to address the needs of returning Mexicans and their families, ensuring that they have access to education, healthcare, housing, and local economies, ensuring their access to, and then strengthening wraparound integration initiatives and recognize the long-term accompaniment is necessary to fully support returnees. The second is acknowledging the increase in documentation and protection services needed for Mexican consulates in the U.S. and support their work with adequate budgets, including personnel. And lastly, create a tracking system for individuals to identify their family members once deported to Mexico. Families in the U.S. are already having a horrific experience being unable to locate their loved ones in ICE custody. This should not be replicated in Mexico, given the amount of data and tracking consulates are doing and sharing amongst themselves. And then to the U.S. federal government, one, reinstate and expand international protection and humanitarian relief mechanisms, such as access to asylum, the refugee resettlement programs, and humanitarian parole, to prevent large populations from becoming stranded in unsafe conditions in Mexico. And second, to strengthen U.S.-Mexico consular coordination, particularly for individuals who have been deported or detained, to ensure access to legal aid, documentation, family reunification, and repatriation support. Again, we invite you to read the report. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you to the panelists for your thoughtful engagement and your continued commitment to supporting migrant communities across borders. As we close, I want to highlight why delegations like this are not just informative, they are transformative. They remind us that migration is a transnational experience and our response must be equally transnational. For a migrant-led network like Alianza Americas, this work is at the heart of our mission. When we bring elected officials, community leaders, organizers, and advocates together to witness realities firsthand, we are building a shared understanding that crosses borders. We are shaping policy, not from a distance, but from lived experience, listening directly to the people most impacted. This delegation is part of a long-term strategy to strengthen the ties between communities in the U.S. and Mexico, to amplify the voices of migrants, and to ensure that our public policies reflect dignity, humanity, and justice. Our power comes from connection across borders, across regions, and across connections. Thank you all for your thoughtful participation today and for your commitment to building a more just and compassionate future for migrant families everywhere. Thank you.